The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the modest suburban home where Samuel and Grace Thompson had raised 3 children who weren't born to them, but chosen with love. At 72 and 70 respectively, they sat at their kitchen table surrounded by moving boxes, their hearts heavier than any physical burden they'd carried in decades. The letters had come one by one over the past year. First from Michael, their oldest, explaining he was too busy with his tech startup to visit anymore. Then Patricia, their daughter, whose new husband apparently didn't feel comfortable around her past. Finally, young James, who'd simply stopped returning calls altogether. The children they'd sacrificed everything for, working double shifts and foregoing their own dreams to provide better lives, had simply walked away. Samuel's weathered hands trembled slightly as he held Grace's, both of them trying to make sense of how love could be so easily discarded. They'd sold their house, the one they'd made into a home despite its flaws, the one where they'd patched scraped knees and celebrated every milestone, because they could no longer afford it on their fixed income, especially not with the medical bills piling up. The adoption agency had promised them family, but nobody had prepared them for this particular kind of heartbreak. As movers carried away furniture that held countless memories, Grace remembered teaching Patricia to bake in that kitchen. Samuel recalled helping Michael with college applications at that dining table, and both remembered young James's laughter echoing through those halls. Now they were leaving with only what fit in their old pickup truck, heading toward a property Samuel had inherited from a distant uncle years ago, a dilapidated cabin in the Appalachian Mountains that everyone had called worthless. Neither of them had seen it in over 20 years, but they had nowhere else to go. Their retirement savings had been depleted helping their children through college, weddings, and various emergencies that were never repaid despite promises. Friends had scattered over the years, and pride kept them from burdening the few who remained with their troubles. As they locked the door for the last time, Grace whispered a prayer not for their children to return, but for strength to build something new from the ruins of their old life. Samuel squeezed her hand 3 times, their secret code for "I love you," and together they walked toward the truck. The mountain awaited them, indifferent to their pain, unknowing of the transformation about to unfold. The dirt road leading to the cabin tested every shock absorber in Samuel's 30-year-old pickup truck as they climbed higher into the Appalachian wilderness. Grace clutched the door handle as the vehicle bounced over ruts and rocks, each jostle reminding them how far they were traveling from everything familiar. Pine trees crowded both sides of the narrow path, their branches occasionally scraping the truck's paint with sounds that made Grace wince. After 2 hours of climbing, they rounded a final bend and saw it, the cabin that would either become their salvation or their grave. Samuel stopped the truck abruptly, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The structure before them was worse than they'd imagined. The roof sagged dramatically in the middle, missing so many shingles that blue sky was visible through gaps. One corner of the porch had completely collapsed, leaving splintered boards jutting out like broken bones. Windows were either shattered or missing entirely, and what remained of the front door hung askew on one rusty hinge. Vines had claimed the entire eastern wall, so thick they obscured whatever siding might still exist underneath. A stone chimney stood intact but leaning slightly, as if considering whether to remain standing or surrender to gravity. Grace felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. They'd driven 6 hours with everything they owned in the truck bed, covered by a tarp that had already torn in 3 places. There was no going back, no other option, no safety net. Samuel seemed to read her thoughts because he climbed out of the truck without a word and walked toward the cabin with determined steps. Grace followed, her sensible shoes crunching on decades of fallen leaves and pine needles. Inside was somehow worse. Animal droppings covered the floor. The smell of mold and rot was overwhelming, and a raccoon family scattered at their intrusion. But as Samuel walked to what remained of a window and looked out at the view, he gasped. Grace joined him and understood immediately. They stood on a mountainside overlooking a valley of such breathtaking beauty that it seemed impossible anything so perfect could exist in the same world as their pain. Rolling mountains stretched to the horizon in shades of green and blue, a creek sparkled far below, and the sky seemed vast enough to hold every dream they'd ever dreamed. "We can do this," Samuel said quietly, though Grace wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. The first night in the cabin was a lesson in humility and determination. With no intact roof overhead, Samuel and Grace slept in the pickup truck's bed, huddled together under blankets as mountain temperatures dropped and strange animal sounds echoed through the darkness. Grace had always been a light sleeper, but exhaustion finally claimed her around 3 in the morning. Samuel stayed awake, one arm around his wife, the other resting on an old baseball bat, the only weapon they had if whatever was howling in the distance decided to investigate further. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed too beautiful for their circumstances, they shared cold coffee from a thermos and stale donuts from a gas station 50 miles back. Neither complained. They'd learned long ago that complaining changed nothing, and their strength had been forged in far hotter fires than this. Samuel's grandfather had been a sharecropper who'd built his own home with his bare hands, and those stories had shaped Samuel's understanding of what was possible when necessity demanded action. After their meager breakfast, Samuel created an inventory of what they had, tools mostly collected over a lifetime of fixing things because they couldn't afford to replace them. A hammer, saw, drill with a dying battery, boxes of various nails and screws, a ladder with a cracked rung, paintbrushes stiff with dried paint, and buckets that had seen better days. Grace organized their few possessions inside the least damaged corner of the cabin, claiming it as their temporary living space. She swept animal droppings with a branch fashioned into a broom, opened the one window that still had glass to air out the mold smell, and hung a sheet across the opening to create some privacy. By mid-morning, Samuel had begun the dangerous work of climbing onto the roof to assess the damage. Each board he tested seemed determined to either crumble under his weight or send him sliding toward the edge. Grace stood below, watching with her heart in her throat, occasionally calling warnings that Samuel pretended not to need but secretly appreciated. By noon, they'd made their first crucial decision. They would rebuild the roof first, then the walls, then worry about making anything pretty. Survival first, beauty later. This approach would define everything that followed. On their third day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Samuel was hammering salvaged boards into the roof when he heard an engine approaching. A battered Jeep emerged from the tree line, driven by a man who appeared to be in his 60s with a beard that would make a mountain man jealous. Grace stepped out from the cabin, immediately wary, her hand instinctively moving toward the kitchen knife she now kept in her pocket. The stranger climbed out slowly, hands visible, clearly reading the tension. "Name's Bill," he called from a respectful distance. "Live about 2 miles down the mountain. Saw smoke from your fire last night and figured I'd check if you were squatters or the new neighbors nobody told me about." Samuel climbed down from the roof, sizing up this stranger, who could be friend or threat. Grace remained still, assessing. Bill explained he'd lived in these mountains for 15 years, ever since his wife passed and his kids stopped calling. The admission hung in the air between them, a shared wound that required no further elaboration. Samuel and Grace exchanged a glance, decades of marriage communicating in that single look, and Samuel extended his hand. Bill shook it firmly, then looked up at the cabin with a low whistle. "You've got your work cut out for you," he observed, but without judgment. "My place isn't much, but I've got some extra materials you might could use. Tin roofing that never got installed, some lumber I've been meaning to do something with for 5 years. Grace found her voice. "We don't have money to pay." Bill waved this away. "Wasn't asking for money. Mountains teach you that money isn't the only currency that matters. You help me clear some fallen trees off my access road come spring. We'll call it even." It was the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Over the following weeks, Bill would prove invaluable, teaching Samuel techniques for working with warped wood, showing Grace which mountain plants were edible and which were poison, sharing tools and knowledge with the generosity of someone who understood that surviving in isolation required occasional cooperation. He never asked about their past, never pried into what brought them to this mountain, and they appreciated his discretion more than any material help. In Bill, they found something their adoptive children had failed to become, chosen family who stayed by choice, not obligation. 6 weeks into their mountain residence, Samuel and Grace had replaced approximately 60% of the roof. Their hands were covered in cuts and calluses, their backs ached constantly, and they'd both lost weight from the physical labor and stretching their limited food supplies. But the cabin was beginning to resemble a structure rather than a ruin. Grace had become surprisingly adept at hammering, her initial tentative taps evolving into confident strikes that drove nails true. Samuel had figured out how to scavenge materials from the collapsed porch to reinforce the roof's frame. Waste nothing, reuse everything. They worked in a rhythm born from decades together, rarely needing words to communicate. One would hold while the other hammered, one would measure while the other cut, moving like dancers who'd perfected their routine through countless performances. But the mountain had its own schedule, and autumn in Appalachia meant storms that arrived with little warning. They were on the roof when the sky suddenly darkened, temperature dropping 20 degrees in as many minutes. Samuel looked west and saw the wall of clouds approaching, black and angry and moving with unnatural speed. "Grace, get down now," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. They scrambled down the ladder as the first raindrops fell, huge, cold bullets that stung exposed skin. Within minutes, the storm was upon them with fury that seemed personal. Wind howled through the valley with a voice that sounded almost human, tearing at their incomplete roof with violent hands. Rain came horizontal, finding every gap in their repairs, turning the cabin's interior into a shower. Thunder cracked so loud it felt like the mountain itself might split apart, and lightning illuminated the world in stark, terrifying flashes. Samuel and Grace huddled in their claimed corner, the one section where the roof held firm, listening to their weeks of work being tested by nature's indifference. A section of tin roofing they'd installed just days before tore loose with a screech of protesting metal and sailed into the darkness. Part of the northern wall's new boards splintered under the wind's assault. When a lightning strike hit a pine tree barely 50 yards from the cabin, splitting it with a crack like a rifle shot, Grace screamed and Samuel pulled her close, both of them wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake coming here. The storm raged for 3 hours that felt like 3 days. Dawn revealed the storm's damage with brutal honesty. A quarter of their roof repairs had been destroyed, blown away, or damaged beyond salvaging. The northern wall had a new hole where wind had found a weakness in Samuel's carpentry. Their water collection system, a series of buckets and tarps arranged to catch rainwater, had been scattered across the mountainside. But as Samuel surveyed the destruction with tired eyes, he noticed something that made him pause. The storm had cleared away years of dead brush and fallen branches from around the cabin, revealing something they hadn't seen before: the remains of a stone foundation, much larger than the current cabin, suggesting the structure had once been more substantial. Grace joined him, following his gaze. "There was more here once," she observed. Bill arrived mid-morning, his jeep loaded with supplies and hot coffee in a thermos that they accepted with grateful hands. He helped them assess the damage, his experienced eye seeing past the immediate destruction to the underlying structure. "Your roof frame held," he pointed out. "That's the important part. Everything else is just surface damage." Together, the three of them worked to salvage what could be saved and clear away what couldn't. As they worked, Bill shared that the cabin had originally belonged to a freedman family in the 1870s, built stone by stone with dreams of safety and autonomy. "Your uncle's great-grandfather built this place," Bill explained. "I found some old county records once when I was researching property lines. Built it big enough for the family he hoped to have, though I don't know if he ever did." The knowledge transformed their understanding of the cabin. This wasn't just a ruin, it was a testament to survival, to Black folks who'd claimed space and built futures in mountains that weren't always welcoming. Grace ran her hand along the exposed stone foundation with new reverence. That night, exhausted but somehow energized, they made a new decision. They wouldn't just repair the cabin to minimal standards, they would honor the original vision. They would rebuild something worthy of the dreams that first raised these stones. The storm that seemed to have destroyed their progress had actually revealed a more ambitious path forward. As October gave way to November, the mountain began its transformation into winter, and Samuel and Grace raced against dropping temperatures to make the cabin livable. Their progress was remarkable for two people in their 70s with limited resources, but the calendar was unforgiving. The roof was now fully repaired and reinforced, capable of handling snow loads that would come. They'd managed to install two salvage windows that Bill had stored in his barn, though both required extensive frame repair first. The chimney, once Samuel had inspected it thoroughly and repointed loose stones, now drew smoke properly, and they'd been able to have their first indoor fire, a celebration that brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. But challenges remained. They had no insulation in the walls, meaning heat escaped as quickly as they could generate it. Their food supplies were dangerously low, and the nearest town was a 3-hour drive on roads that would become impassable once snow fell. Grace's arthritis was flaring in the cold, making mornings particularly difficult until she could warm her joints. Samuel had developed a persistent cough that worried both of them, though he insisted it was just dust from their construction work. One morning, Grace woke to find the water in their bucket had frozen solid overnight. They'd need to solve their heating problem soon or risk serious consequences. Samuel spent that day constructing a second sleeping platform directly above the fireplace, where rising heat would keep them warmer at night. Grace used every scrap of fabric they owned to create additional blankets, her fingers working by firelight when daylight faded too quickly. Bill taught them which trees were safe to harvest for firewood without damaging the forest ecology, and they spent days cutting and splitting logs, building a supply they hoped would last until spring. The physical labor was grueling, but it kept them warm and focused. As they worked, they rarely discussed their adoptive children, but the absence was always present, an invisible fourth companion in everything they did. Grace sometimes wondered what Patricia would think seeing her mother hauling water uphill from the creek, or how Michael would react to his father shingling a roof at 72. Would they feel guilt? Pride? Or had they simply moved on entirely, erasing Samuel and Grace from their narratives as if 20-plus years of parenting could be forgotten like a finished chapter in someone else's book? The first snow fell on a Tuesday in late November, beginning as a few tentative flakes that Grace noticed while making breakfast over the fireplace. Within an hour, the world had transformed into a wonderland of white that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. By afternoon, 6 inches had fallen, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. Samuel and Grace stood at their new window watching the valley below disappear under a blanket of white, the creek's sparkle muted, the distant mountains becoming ghostly suggestions rather than solid presences. The cabin, for all their work, revealed new weaknesses under winter's assault. Cold air found gaps they hadn't known existed, creating drafts that made candles flicker and burned through their firewood faster than anticipated. But they'd prepared as best they could. Their water supply was secured in containers near the fireplace where it wouldn't freeze. Food was rationed to last until spring, supplemented by the venison Bill had shared from his hunting. They had blankets, books salvaged from boxes they hadn't yet unpacked, and most importantly, they had each other. As snow continued to fall, accumulating to 12 inches by nightfall, Grace pulled out a journal she'd kept sporadically throughout her life. She began to write, documenting not just their daily struggles, but her evolving understanding of what they were building. "We came here broken," she wrote, "abandoned by children we loved more than our own comfort. We came here with nothing but each other and a ruin on a mountain. But somewhere between hammering nails and hauling water, between storms that tried to break us and mornings that blessed us with impossible beauty, we stopped being victims of our circumstances and became architects of something new." Samuel read over her shoulder, his presence a warmth no fireplace could match. "You should write to them," he suggested quietly. "Not for the first time. The kids." Grace closed the journal. "What would I say? We're still here despite your abandonment. We've built a life without you." Samuel considered this. "Maybe just, we forgive you, and the door is always open." Grace wasn't sure she'd reached forgiveness yet, but she appreciated Samuel's generous heart, even when it hurt. That night, as wind howled around their cabin and snow piled against their door, they slept warmer than they had in weeks, their preparations paying dividends they could feel in every comfortable breath. Spring arrived like a promise kept, snowmelt feeding the creek until it roared with life. Wildflowers exploding in colors Grace had forgotten existed, purple and yellow and red carpeting the mountainside. With warmer weather came the culmination of their labors. The cabin was now fully enclosed, properly roofed, and insulated with material Bill had helped them acquire in exchange for work they'd done clearing his land. Samuel had rebuilt the porch, this time with proper foundation and supports that would last decades. Grace had established a garden in soil enriched by years of fallen leaves, planting seeds Bill had saved from his own harvests. The stone foundation they'd uncovered during the storm had inspired Samuel's most ambitious project. He'd begun extending the cabin, using stones from a collapsed wall elsewhere on the property to create a larger living space that honored the original builder's vision. It was slow work, but they had nothing but time. Grace had transformed the interior into a home that reflected their journey. Salvaged wood became shelves displaying rocks and feathers they'd collected on mountain walks. Fabric scraps became curtains that filtered sunlight into warm patterns. The fireplace Samuel had repaired was now the heart of a room that felt lived in, loved, purposeful. They'd even managed to get solar panels, secondhand but functional, that provided enough power for lights, and the small refrigerator Bill had helped them transport up the mountain. By May, when the mountain was at its most beautiful, they sat on their completed porch one evening and realized something profound. They'd created paradise not despite their abandonment, but through it. The necessity of rebuilding had stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only what mattered: purpose, partnership, and presence. They discovered that home wasn't the house their children had abandoned them from. Home was wherever they chose to pour their love and labor. Grace had started a small business selling preserves made from wild mountain berries, connecting with tourists in the nearest town who prized authentic mountain crafts. Samuel had become known as someone who could fix almost anything, and neighbors from across the mountain would occasionally arrive with broken tools or questions about construction. On a warm afternoon in July, nearly a year after they'd arrived at the mountain, an unfamiliar car struggled up the dirt road toward the cabin. Samuel and Grace had learned to identify vehicles by sound: Bill's Jeep, the mail carrier's truck, the occasional lost tourist. This engine was different, newer, struggling with the terrain in ways that suggested unfamiliarity. They stood on their porch, curious but not concerned. The car rounded the final bend and stopped. For a long moment, nobody emerged. Then the driver's door opened, and Patricia stepped out. She was older than Grace remembered, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during their last strained conversation. She was followed by Michael, then James, all three of them standing by the car, as if afraid to approach. The silence stretched until Samuel finally spoke. "You found us." "It took a while," Michael admitted. "You didn't leave a forwarding address." "You didn't ask for one," Grace observed, her voice neutral. Patricia stepped forward, tears already streaming. "We're sorry. God, Mom, Dad, we're so sorry. We were selfish and cruel, and we abandoned you when you needed us most, and there's no excuse, but we're here now to what?" Samuel interrupted gently. "To make it right? To take us back to civilization? To rescue us from this mountain." He gestured at the cabin behind them, the garden bursting with life, the view stretching to forever. "We don't need rescuing." James, the youngest, looked confused. "But you're living in the middle of nowhere. You're building something real," Grace finished. "Something that can't abandon us, because it's made from our own hands and hearts." The afternoon became a conversation years overdue. The children explained their reasons: pressure, shame, the difficulty of acknowledging their own privilege while their Black parents struggled. They'd convinced themselves Samuel and Grace were resilient enough not to need them, creating a narrative that absolved guilt. They'd been wrong. Samuel and Grace shared their journey, from the first night sleeping in the truck to the storm that nearly broke them to the gradual creation of something unexpectedly beautiful. As they talked, something subtle shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding. By evening, they'd reached an agreement. The children would return to their lives, but they would stay connected, and they would visit regularly. Samuel and Grace would remain on their mountain, in their paradise built from ruins. Because sometimes the best response to abandonment isn't waiting for rescue. It's building something so beautiful that even those who left you behind want to be part of your story again. As the car descended the mountain carrying their children back toward highways and cities, Samuel squeezed Grace's hand 3 times. She squeezed back 4, their code for I love you more. Behind them, their cabin stood solid against the evening sky, testament to the truth that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're truly capable of building.